Where do you see the list of participants? Do you have
So
to...
you would see the participants at the bottom of your screen. If
Oh,
you
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, we'll give it 1 or 2 minutes for everyone to be able to sign in, and then we will get it started.
I see just the number of the participants, but not the
Yeah,
name.
so if you click on that, a chat box would open, right? And you would be able to see that.
Chat box?
On the
Yes, the chat box, it's open, but when I look at participants, it says 25. And
yeah, if you click on that, then you would see a list.
Oh, yeah, now I can see it. Yeah.
Well, that's good to know because I haven't got to that point yet. I was like, what? I'm looking at the thumbnail with all of us.
Right.
Like, okay. Yeah. Shouldn't there be some little dialogue box there? But
yeah, it can get a bit confusing.
That's okay.
Yeah. All right, we'll give it 1 more minute for people to join, and then we will get it started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another roundtable, which is a collaboration between Center for Race and Culture and Calgary Catholic Immigration Society. And the title of today's roundtable, as you know, is Exploring the Impacts of Pandemic on Immigrants. And this will be a conversation with Ricardo Morales, Director of Community Development and Integration Services and Southern Alberta Rural Initiatives, Dr. Sinela Jurkova, Diversity Services Coordinator at Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, and Dr. Jingzhou Liu, researcher and journalist, who would be also moderating the session. So as for land acknowledgement, even though we are not gathered in the same physical space, we would like to acknowledge the land that CFRAC occupies on Treaty 6 territory, traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respects to the elders, past and present, who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. Considering that we will be having this discussion, we want to acknowledge how important it is to highlight the existing issues for the Indigenous peoples in Alberta as well, at the time of the pandemic specifically. And if you're interested to learn more about this subject, we also recommend an article called Breathe Together, Co-Conspirators for the Colonial Futures, where you would see a new discussion on this issue. So a little bit about Center for Race and Culture. Since its establishment in 1993, the center, formerly known as the Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism, and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. If you would like to learn more about current events, projects, and activities, please visit our website or contact me, Mansoura Modares, who I am the consultant of this initiative, and also my colleague Miriam Gerber, to know more about this initiative and to participate in our discussions. So this roundtable, this session is part of a new initiative that we have launched in CFRAC called Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations, an ongoing series of online moderated roundtables and webinars with guest speakers and diverse communities, organizations, academia, and the general public. We seek to understand and address experiences of discrimination and exclusion in the Canadian context, by shining the spotlight on different forms of discrimination, such as anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and discrimination against communities, amongst other topics. We hope to encourage solidarity among groups and individuals interested in promoting social inclusion and equity. So yes, here's the information in case you would like to contact us. All right, so in this session, as I suggested, we are going to have this conversation with Ricardo Morales, who is the Director of Community Development and Integration Services in Southern Alberta Rural Initiatives, a division of Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS. During his experience, his long experience in education, at the Key University, he served as a teacher, university associate, intercultural consultant, and a school principal. Ricardo is currently providing leadership for CCIS in the area of cultural diversity and community development. He completed postgraduate studies in intercultural relations and has a postgraduate certificate as an intercultural practitioner. And of course, I've had to shorten the bios. I'm sure they will share more with you once they start their talks, but I will move to Dr. Sinela Jurkova, who holds a PhD in adult learning and a master's in communication and culture from University of Calgary. Her areas of specialization include transcultural, transformative learning, intercultural communication and competence, strategies for diversity, theories, and practices for inclusive education. Sinela has published in academic journals and presented numerous sessions about cultural competency, ethnic diversity, and integration, and has participated in international academic conferences. And the third presenter and the moderator of the session is Jingzhou Liu, who earned her doctorate in adult learning at the University of Calgary. Her research interests include racialized immigrants, transition to work and workplace learning, intersectionality theory, institutional ethnography, international students, and comparative and international education. She's recently published peer-reviewed journal articles, and she also works with the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society. So, okay, without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Joe, but before we do that, I would like to share with you sort of an anonymous poll that we share with our participants in order to gain some anonymous data, demographic data of our participants, which would help us in developing our work at the center. So if you could take 1 minute and answer these few questions, that would be really helpful to us to plan accordingly for our future events. And again, this is anonymous, and of course you have the option not to answer each question. So we'll give it 1 minute. Okay, 10 more seconds and I will close the poll. All right, thanks so much for this. Thanks again for our colleagues in Calgary Catholic Immigration Society for taking part in this event and collaborating with us. And I am now handing the screen basically over to Joe for the discussion to get started.
Thank you. So before, thanks for having us. So before we start, I would like to give you a brief disclaimer. So what we're illustrating and sharing and focusing on today is based on our personal theoretical-based research, as well as our observation and our personal stories. Some people might have experienced differently, and it doesn't mean that Canadians from other culture backgrounds would have not experienced the same as well. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Just give me 1 second. It happens again. Okay. So in today's session, we're going to focus on this four elements, basically the previous three. So I will be focusing on contextualizing intersectionality theory in the context of COVID-19, and Rick will be focusing on media and ethnocultural communities' perceptions of this outbreak impacts, especially to vulnerable populations. And Sinela will be sharing her understanding analysis on giving recommendations for individuals in this changing, multifaceted learning space. And at the end of our session, we'll be giving enough time for our participants to raise your questions, having discussion going on, and reflect on your daily practices as well. So from today's session, we're hoping to answer these following questions. So I'm not going to go through this all one by one, but mostly we're going to focus on how social oppression has been produced to specific or certain ethnic groups, and also newcomers population and their impacts, disproportionately impact by the COVID-19, and also what are the responses that organizations should be providing to respond to the crisis in this COVID-19, and also how we are going to be revisiting and renegotiating our intersectional transcultural identities in understanding this pandemic outbreak. So first, I would like to start with contextualizing intersectionality theory. I'm pretty sure that many of you have heard this theory. You are more than familiar this theory than me. So I use this theory in my doctoral research. So I'm going to share my understanding of this theory with you today in the session. So of course, we need to start with the creation of this theory, which was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor in the US. Initially, she was trying to address the complexity of female African Americans in the US, and try to acknowledge how race, gender, and class as distinct social categories of identity that mutually produce social inequality. And after that, I found that this theory or this term can be a form of inquiry, critical inquiry, and practices to understand the complexity and multiplicity to respond of social inequality, to respond to global context of social oppression. And also it promotes an understanding of people's lived experiences as shaped by the interaction and intersection differences between social locations. And also in the past 2 decades, this term has been broadly used as a theory, as a methodology in different disciplines, including nursing, psychology, sociology, education, etc. And really this term has now extended from its initial triadic understanding of a focus on race, gender, and class to a more kind of broader or holistic or comprehensive approach in terms of understanding people's identity. You can see on the left-hand side, we have a picture that captures people's identity through different perspectives. So the way that I understand intersectionality, because it is pretty complex and pretty broad in different ways and different perspectives, is through these 6 core ideas or elements. So the first one is called social inequality. It really encourages us to move beyond seeing social inequality from one kind of perspective, for example, race only, gender only, class only lens, instead to treat people's lived experiences or oppressed lived experiences in the more kind of intersectional categories. So the second core idea is called power. This one is it helps me to understand how power can be situated in a kind of global context of capitalism, nationalism, and neoliberalism, and how this notion of power really stratifies superiority and subordination to global society inequality. So the third core idea is called relationality. It really embraces us in terms of understanding how social categories can be collectively shaping social inequality in a global context, and also this one is pretty straightforward. It focuses on how important is when you are contextualizing people's lived experiences. You need to understand not only from a one kind of context perspective, but more kind of perspective from his or her historical, political, cultural, and economic context. The fifth one is called complexity. This one really connects the previous 4 elements well and introduce a complexity understanding of how people's intersectional identity can be shaping through this global complexity and multiplicity social inequality. So the 6th one is called social injustice. It's the contentious core idea of intersectionality. And also it really helped us to take actions to become a participatory participants and taking actions to direct people to foster more inclusive social environment or social community for all. So when I try to capture these 6 core ideas, I found that power is the key to understand inequality or social inequality in the context of COVID-19. So I capture power relations into these 4 dimensions. So the first one is individual dimension. It really focuses on interpersonal and inner relationships that are embedded in social categories within different ethnic groups and communities. Social dimension is the response to how these external social relations will respond to the internal relations. Institutional dimensions has 2 layers. The first is how governmental operations and policies, they are helping out and trying to take social responsibilities to solve the problem of social inequality. At the same time, it reproduces social inequality at the local level. So the structural dimension is how this previous 3 dimensions, they are kind of working together and configures gaps in understanding differentiations and produce or entrenches social attitudes towards certain ethnic groups. So if I try to connect intersectionality to this layers of COVID-19 and its pandemic outbreak, and it's the completion of this outbreak, I try to find out some examples. So one example that I could give you is the key factors of a person's intersectional identity that produces or influences his or her health outcomes. So we could see that there's a person who is trying to push a ball up to the ramp. We could see that the ramp may steeper or shorter by the numbers of key conditions that this person may have. So for example, if a person who is a migrant worker with a work permit working in a rural area as a factory, and she is an elderly person, then her likelihood to be sick with COVID-19 is much more than a person who is a Caucasian Canadian who is in his younger age. And next, I would like to give you some studies that have been done in different countries. So first, it's a study that has been done in the UK. It's called Office for National Statistics. So they collected data from March the 2nd to April the 10th, focusing on the risk of COVID-19 related to death by ethnic group. So we could see from the males and females group, Black ethnic individuals, they are twice more likely to die from COVID-19 compared to white ethnicity. Secondly, we could see that Bangladesh and Pakistani ethnic groups, individuals, they are twice more likely to die from COVID-19 compared to white ethnicity as well. So when we look at studies from the US, we could see that this is a very recent study that has been done which collected data from April the 13th to August the 18th. We could see that Black Americans, they are the top ethnic groups to die from COVID-19 compared to white ethnicity in the US. And also we could see that Indigenous Americans, they are almost 2.5 likely to die from COVID-19 as well. So when we break down to age group, we could see that Black racial groups, they are 3.6 more likely to die from COVID-19 compared to Asian ethnic groups, and Indigenous racial groups as well. They are having a 3.4 more likelihood to die from COVID-19. So when we look at Canadian studies, we know that not much studies have been done focusing on ethnic or race specific data collection. But here I found something that was done from Ontario. So this study really focuses on how the most ethnoculturally diverse neighborhoods in Ontario, they are having more cases compared to the list diverse neighborhoods in Ontario. And also the rate of COVID-19 infections in most diverse neighborhoods was three times higher than the rate in the least diverse neighborhoods. And also we could know that people living in most diverse neighborhoods were also more likely to experience severe outcomes such as hospitalization, ICU admissions, and deaths than people living in the least diverse neighborhoods. So in the past 6 months or more, we found that COVID-19 has really transferred itself from a virus to a production of social oppression. So here I would like to give you a personal story of mine. We know that Asian female groups, they are one of the most kind of dominant target social racial groups, which has been experiencing racial discrimination in the past 6 months after the pandemic outbreak. So here's the story of mine. So I started to wear a mask in the very early stage. I would say in early February, I started to wear a mask because my parents, they wanted me to wear the mask. They said in this way I could protect virus from coming into my body. I could tell the moment that when I put the mask on, people would react differently. They will interact with me differently. They will even behave differently compared to me without a mask on. So one day when I went to a grocery store, there was a lady who was being kind to me. She said to me that, oh, if you're sick, maybe you should be staying at home and then ask your friends or family to get grocery from you. I was a bit frustrating, and I was also feeling a bit confusing in terms of my cultural practice of putting a mask on. So in many Asian countries, when you put a mask on, that means that, of course, your trying to protect others from spreading virus from you to others. At the same time, most importantly, you are protecting self from getting virus from others. But here, or in many Western countries, at the very beginning, at the early stage of the outbreak, if you're putting a mask on, that means you're sick. Especially if you are having an Asian-looking female, then people will assume that you are having COVID. So instead of being misunderstood by others, I try to put a very simple sentence on every mask that I put at a very early stage when I went out. So I put a sentence that I'm not sick, just for self-protection. So this kind of readjustment of my cultural practice really helped me to readapt myself to this Western cultural context. So people, they started to smiling at me. Some people will even come over and said that it's all right. Just do the ways that you feel comfortable with. There is no misunderstanding right there. So this is a learning process in terms of me integrating to a Western context and cultural context, and how I learn as an Asian female in this COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. So I think I'm going to pause it here. I will give the floor to Rick, and he will be focusing on how media and ethno-cultural communities, they are responding to this COVID-19 outbreak, and how especially immigrant service organizations, they are helping out to vulnerable individuals and community. Over to you, Rick.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, it is my pleasure to share in this series hosted by the Center for Race and Culture, and to provide a social commentary on some of the reported incidents of overt and covert acts of racism targeted to specific ethnic groups stemming from this pandemic. Now, I know that since the pandemic in the last couple of months, we've had different outbreaks of racism, or race pandemic, as I like to say. But what I'd like to focus on is seeing how COVID-19, not unlike other pandemics in the sense that it has given rise to a global health and economic crisis, it has also brought this whole notion of race and targeted groups to the forefront. This begs the question, but before I get to the question, I came across a quote on social media which stated, "We all in the same storm, but we not all in the same boat." But I really question that statement in some ways, and I really take sort of an inkling to some of the comments coming through in the earlier stages of the pandemic from the media saying that we're all in this together. I really wonder, are we truly in this together, equally experiencing the same fears, uncertainties, hopes, or dreams? Or is the impact of COVID-19 eliciting increased acts of racism and discrimination? Slide 14, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. If we take a look at some of the headlines, we are often bombarded with headlines from south of us. But I want to bring your attention to what is happening nationally in Canada. Here's a cross-section of some of the headlines that were making the rounds. It is quite evident that some of the responses directed towards the ethnic population in society is not regionalized, but it is being experienced from coast to coast. So what could be, or what is giving rise to these acts of racism? And I wonder at times if there's not an underlining or predisposition within our society itself. So the next slide. The next slide is shows some data that was taken from Statistics Canada. And I was very intrigued by this because it shows to me that there's a wide exposure to racist and prejudiced comments coming through the social media. If we take a look at the prairie provinces, you will see the percentage of disproportionate amount throughout Canada. And I'm really intrigued to see, in fact, where the highest numbers are. And I see that Indigenous people, then followed by the immigrants, and then LGBTQ. So again, we're seeing that, and I asked the question, is there some predisposition in our culture that is giving rise to some of these overt and coverted attitudes and behaviors around race and targeted groups? Next slide, please. In this particular slide, what I notice here again is that oftentimes we defer to racism as a phenomena that tends to be propagated more in the media, in the American media. But I want to turn the lens back to the Canadian context. And I noticed that while we could make comments about leaders from the United States, I see some of our political leaders, again in the press, propagating a certain belief. And it is not unlike us to think that we are that different. The poll by the COVID communication groups really points out again, some of the treatment that was happening during this particular pandemic. And I am so intrigued by the fact that what is giving rise to people in a pandemic situation that would cause them to act this way. And I wonder if there's not an inherent fear, if there's not, if people become more vulnerable during this time, and then there's a greater tendency then to lay blame or to give it some tangible, defined object to identify the cause for the pandemic. Next slide, please. So again, I come back to where is this all situated? And you know, it's a big question to try to grapple with as to where does racist attitudes or prejudice or discriminatory type of behaviors and attitudes stem from. And this is very intriguing to me that when I look at this in the prairies, in particular, I'm most likely to hear racist prejudice comments about Indigenous peoples from friends and family members, while Quebecers hear most negative comments about Muslims. And then again, if we look at the prairie percentage, you can see how this is disaggregated. So we take a look at this and we move to the next slide, and we see that already there are some pre-existing conditions that may, and with the onset of COVID, we see more and more of these attitudinal type and behaviors coming forth. And we see here now that throughout, we can see examples from the media of targeted acts of microaggression. I wonder how many individuals were subjected to or continue to be subjected to commonplace daily verbal or behavioral indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes toward a stigmatized or culturally marginalized people. And we see this happening through some of these news media excerpts. Interestingly enough, as we talk about certain groups that have been targeted, I went across to the media, and I picked up a feed from ABC News that spoke about how in China, that China was also blaming foreigners, and especially Black foreigners, and were almost trying to get them to leave China, certain regions of that. So I think the phenomena of scapegoating, of blaming, even though we could see that being very prevalent, I think it's not only contextualized to Canada, but we're seeing it worldwide. So again, this COVID or this racism associated with COVID, is this driven by fear? Is this driven by people's uncertainties? Is there a need to blame? Is there a need to objectify? Is there a need to point out? And in our whole dilemma of trying to deal with this particular pandemic, is it easier to lay it on to someone else? Slide 19, please. So again, we see some more headlines, that's talking about not only COVID, but I take a look at some of the phenomena that happened to some of the pandemics in the past. And what I notice here that some of the outbreaks were racialized, as reported by Robert Keel, professor in the Environmental Studies Department at York University, when he talked about the impact of SARS on the city of Toronto in 2003. During that outbreak, there was public, fearful, again, targeted against Asians. We saw Ebola and HIV diseases were initially seen as exclusively African and Black in nature. Other infections like Zika, malaria are seen as tropical, and against it's more again associated with people in Latin American countries. In 1993, the hantavirus infection was dubbed the Navajo disease. By contrast, neither H1N1 or the swine flu in April 2009, which emerged in North America, nor mad cow disease, which primarily affected the UK, generated any racial or ethnic backlash. Yet those which were allegedly originated in China, like SARS and coronavirus, consistently correlated with the xenophobia. Next slide, please. I know my colleague mentioned this particular study that came out from Ontario, that we're seeing that this COVID has given rise to targeted, racialized, and marginalized communities. And this pandemic, again, is helping to illustrate how deeply rooted we still are in inequities in society. We see that in countries where there's great stratification of people and disparities on the basis of race, economics, social, and cultural engagement in society, we see, in fact, how our pandemic impacts these marginalized groups differently. I found it very interesting that earlier on in the April, May, there were quite a few reports coming out of the United States proclaiming an overwhelming number of Black and Latino residents that have died in this virus compared with other groups. When they consider what was happening in Chicago, that there were 30% of the Black population, 30% of Blacks made up that population, but there were about 70% of the COVID-related cases were attributed in the Black areas. In New York City, more Latino and Black residents were also suffered disproportionately according to the other population base. But in Canada, there's no attempt to look at this data from a race-based perspective. However, they focus on looking at the social determinants of health, such as education or income and risk factors. That piece has been reported out. And I wonder why that is the case, when we could see quite clearly that the evidence coming out of places like Ontario, that we do have marginalized and targeted communities that are impacted more so than others. So I want to bring this back now closer to home. And I'll go to the next slide. And I'll take a look at a case of what happened in Southern Alberta. Back in April, our organization, CCIS, was called in to partner with different community organizations, EMGA, and we had Action Dignity, and we were called in by Alberta Health Services to intervene and to provide some needs assessment to find out how we could provide assistance to the workers at this meat packing plant. But what came about from this was pretty interesting. Let's go to the next slide, please. We see what was revealed during this period of time illustrated greater social and economic disparities of how disadvantaged ethnic population exists in society, revealing more of their vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to unwarranted attacks and they became targets of derision. Cargill is one of these meat processing plants in Southern Alberta, and they employed about 2,300 people, with a fair number of them living in the communities of High River and Okotoks, and again, a proportion of this population residing also in Calgary. These workers are made up mainly of from different immigrant groups where English is a second language, And a number of these workers utilize carpooling as a means of transportation. They also live in households with multiple families. And again, the question, I really raised the question as they became targets during that this particular past couple of months. The question raises, why was it that this particular group, who were providing some essential services and were and contribute so effectively to different aspects of the community and the nation and the economy, became targets? So if we go to the next slide, I think there became some perceptions were coming out within the community, and the perceptions came out that if you looked a certain way, you must work at Cargill. Therefore, you are probably a carrier of this disease, and you're probably at fault for bringing it into the community. There was a widespread fear at this particular time that there could possibly be a community spread. And, sadly to say that even though within that community, there were a great number of folks who, came forward to our organization, and they demonstrated some benevolent acts of kindness in terms of wanting to provide support. I must say too that we did have people from that particular meat plant that were shunned. They were blamed. Some were said to go back home. Some were denied access into grocery stores. Some were denied access at banks and different institutions. And it became a community response. If we go to the next slide, please. It became a community response in terms of how should a community react during this particular time? And what is our role in trying to reach out to people who are not only impacted, but also are living in great fear. There was a great deal of fear about their food, about their jobs, about their lives. I mean, we had a couple of deaths as a result of what happened in this particular situation. And I think one of the things to keep in mind as we look at some of the impacts of this is the outbreak and its results have impacted families and individuals across Canada. The ensuing perceptions of the outbreaks have the power to impact public health measures, social and cultural experiences, and to inform systemic responses, communal practices of pathways to working and responding to different ethnic populations through a lens of cultural diversity. We still have miles to go with transforming cultural thinking and understanding about ourselves and our reactions to uncertainties and how we perceive others. Without advocacy, education, understanding, and proactive measures, the impact of COVID-19 will continue to claim victims and compile statistics, challenge health and economic sectors, all the while the undercurrent of racism and undue blaming goes unchecked, fostering more of us and them instead of a compassionate and more humanly we. Next slide, please. I would like to say at this particular time, when we take a look at what's happening during COVID, we see that we need to speak up to all oppression because there is a connection and we know that they intersect at different points. At this point in time, I'd like to pass this over now to my colleague, Dr. Jurkova.
Thank you, Rick. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So first, I would like to thank you, the Center for Race and Culture, for having us, for inviting us, and for taking this wonderful initiative for community education and spreading our experience, observations, and research. And what I will do at the rest of the session, I would like to connect the experience and observation that Joe and Rick just talked about with the path of learning that can transform us to a person and a community with conscious and competent reaction when we serve culturally diverse population, considering intersectional identities that we represent in different situations. So these slides visualize and present to you the transcultural path of learning, which is dynamic and holistic process through which an individual develops cognitive, social, and emotional and affective qualities. And in this journey, individuals influenced by internal and external factors that in this situation, let's consider COVID as such external factor, challenge and change the perspective, the frames of reference to more inclusive. So through inquiry, framing, positionality, dialogue, and reflection. And the process is not straightforward, linear, and smooth, but it's complex and might be challenging with struggles and power dispositions, with stabilizing, destabilizing effects. But empowered with transcultural competence, the person can act as an advocate, a mentor, an educator, and a leader to promote and foster inclusion in organization and a societal level. So how these concepts relate to the situation that we experience now? Identifying the coronavirus as an external factor for transformative learning, or if we define COVID as a crisis. However, crisis is not something that paralyzes us and our reaction, rather stimulates to find ways to move forward and opportunity to learn, a moment of time to take different path, to transform from this disorienting dilemma. Next slide, please, Joe. So as actors in these pandemic circumstances, we develop, as I mentioned, cognitive, emotional, and social quality. The deficiency in each component might affect our reaction and action in this new context. For example, we hear that we are all in danger to contract the virus, but not equally exposed to this situation. And when we provide service, we must be knowledgeable about different needs and the interpretation of the situation by those who have different experience or lives and dealing with extreme situations and disasters, knowledge about different values that different groups have, and also the traditions that may impact the reaction of these groups in certain situations in different way. For example, many organizations, including food providing agency, offer food for vulnerable groups during the outbreak. But is the food culturally and religiously appropriate, especially in the early stage of COVID? The situation, the time was around some Muslim religious celebration. So I have heard comments like, we help them and these groups are complaining that they don't like the food and they are so picky. We have heard many times that African community has been most severely affected by COVID. One reason is that they are low income and suffer of poverty and unemployment. But there are other reasons as well. Language knowledge, the level of education of the members of this society, the previous trauma that they experience as refugee, living in refugee camps in their own country, in other country, the isolation in own community, and also the isolation in Canadian culture. Combining all these results with lack of trust in the system, and the authorities, and ability for them to understand most of the instructions for safety because they are written or spoken on English. So knowing these specific cultural preferences in living traditions and family, economic situations, about specific groups, religious values, is this cognitive knowledge that I talk about, that we have to consider serving different cultures. As educators and service providers, if we are not enough informed and knowledgeable about the culturally specific needs of our client, but just assuming the path to stereotype, exclusion, and discrimination, it's very short. Emotional aspect of learning is significantly important in such situation. We should be able to express our sympathy, empathy, kindness, and humility. I have heard comments from more pragmatically oriented people or service providers communicating from a very direct style. There is a work to be done, and we are focused to provide immediate help for these people who have need. We do not have time to express our feelings now or emotional support. I totally disagree with this. We must be able to express humility. We are in a similar situation, but impacted differently because we have different experience and values, different feelings and sensitivities. Comparison how much or how less someone is affected by COVID does not help. But sharing and expressing humility using the appropriate words from our heart can alleviate the pain and the struggle for these groups. We hear more about increased cases of hate crime against Asians. And you saw what Rick and Joe talked about. So when we witness such cases, we should not stay silent because silence encouraged aggression. We have to speak up and educate and support emotionally the victims. I'm asking you, how many of you know how the salad and meat for your lunch know where it comes from, how it comes to your table, the process of the production, the condition that temporary foreign workers work to have your meal delivered. Instead of changing working and living conditions for temporary foreign workers, the society developed negative attitude toward them because they spread out the virus. And we have these examples at Cargill, in some agricultural farming in eastern part of Canada. How can be explained the recent outbreak in 2 meat plants near Calgary just recently, a few days ago? We already have the outbreak in Brooks in High River. So is it this employer's negligence or lack of sensitivity and support and care for their employees, or to be more direct, or using this, using cheap works without care much who deliver this work? The third part is the social aspect of learning. We are not only alone together, we are together alone, if I can paraphrase this, meaning that we are still belong to the community and the neighborhood we live in, the organization that we work for, our family, even nearby or far abroad. How do we interact under this physical isolation and all the restrictions that we experience? Since March, our lives moved online and virtual. Online classes, homeschooling, remote work, online art performances, yoga, fitness, you'll name it all. We use most of our time with our devices to rethink the kinds of community and services we can create through this. We apply our most human instincts to our devices, let's say, that became a powerful COVID-19 legacy. Even we slowly open now to back normal, it won't be the same normal that we know from before. We have to think about the help that our clients may need to receive online service. Not everyone is comfortable or well equipped and have knowledge about the technology and navigate through this technology. We are dealing with the consequences of the pandemic in our lives. School preparation, we just witnessed a few days ago, it was distributed broadly that all schools are prepared, and we just heard today that there are some cases in several schools, so now they are sent back to home. So changing all this class environment, the roles of behaviors and behaviors of the teachers, kids, the parents, the process of learning will be affected. So our workplaces, the society for and the favorable activities that we like to do and experience, even art participation and community arts programs. So all this is kind of stuck and frozen and will be changed in different modes. So referring to motivation for transcultural learning in the recent situation, it is rather how the COVID-19 served as disorienting dilemma and an external factor that invaded our life broadly and the society, and definitely we can see how it transforms us. Next slide, please, Joe. So let me talk now a bit about these different stages of transformative learning that we move through while we live and learn in transcultural environment where we cannot separate local from global. You see every day, you hear from media information and updates from all over the world, how different countries deal with the same situation. The numbers of death, the new cases, unemployment level, financial indexes, emergency funds, and so on and so on. So we are transnationally wired, even in physical distance time, and with the border restrictions to not cross, let's say, US borders or traveling across provinces. So what does inquiry mean at the COVID state of emergency? It means to stay informed about the situation, knowing our limits in a pandemic, speaking honestly about what we know and what we don't know, keep balance of information, and don't overwhelm with all negative news and conspiracy theories, for example, that were broadly distributed in all these social media platforms. For example, the conversation about vaccine will be good or helpful or will affect other disease later, or it will be required for everybody, or so on. All these questions that bother us. So no one actually know what will be. But different opinion, theories, rumors are spread broadly, and we have to make conscious decision what will be good for us, for our family, for the clients that we work with and support. So let's explore also different angles of all these venues of information that we are bombarded, and dedicate more time to expand our own knowledge that will help us to stay safe and to provide better and safer services for others. The stage of framing. This is about taking different perspective and look through different lenses. One solution is not good for all. When you read news, consider the source, whom we can trust more, how the sense of trust has been changed. Statistic Canada recently presented a survey about the level of trust in media, government institutions, and health authorities. And for Canadian born and for new immigrants, the level of trust is pretty much equal. However, if you compare this level of trust with the trust in US institutions and governance, you can see the huge disproportion. In US, people do not trust their government agencies and institutions. Also, another point of this framing stage, its ability to shift perspective between global and local, to understand better what is important in the global and in local perspective, and how these global changes and movements will affect local and vice versa. Positionality, it's where you are in terms of power in relations to other. We witness the change of power and respect based on professional positionality. For example, before COVID, the highest power and respect was toward Army Force and police as peacekeepers and protecting us. You can see what happened with the trust to police with this recent Black Lives Matter. Now we also recognize the sacrifice of the frontline workers, like doctors, nurses, caregivers, teachers, store clerks, even utility workers and small business owners. So this illustrates that the leverage of power in the society, it's very dynamic. It changes under different circumstances. As I said earlier, temporary foreign workers and new immigrants are overexposed as risk workers, taking jobs that mainstreams are reluctant to do and don't take. These employees, positioned very low in the social spectrum of power, are identified as low-skilled workers, even using terms that are that have this negative expression like indispensable or disposable workers. They are most vulnerable, although they provide the essential product for us and food security. So positionality is also defining what is the level of your control, what you can do. By being aware of the context when we interpret and judge situation. I'll give you another example, the covered faces. Covering faces for religious purposes. You have heard, and listened a lot, all these the discussions of highly opposing religious symbols in Quebec or in many European countries. And recent recommendation for covering faces with masks for safety reasons. We heard this joke that before we fined because of covering face on public space, and now we're fined for not covering face on public space. Have you heard recently any discussions against covering face for religious purposes? But you see on each building and store that you must cover your face, otherwise you are not allowed to enter. This illustrates how the same act has different interpretation depending on the context and the situations. Dialogue is a really important part of developing our transcultural transformative competence. In transcultural concept, dialogue is a path for cognition. It is a medium for transformative learning. The role of dialogue on the boundaries between different culture, between past and our new experience. It's also about communication with respect and empathy, trying to position yourself in other shoes and reposition yourself, refraining your action and work. Reflection is about our capacity to learn from introspection and from the current situation, ability to observe as agent of change. How did you change and how flexible you are to change in the new situation? How comfortable you are in the new situation? We are fortunate to live in a safe place, rich with resources and social support, which create higher level of comfort, let's say, but also it slows down our flexibility to switch to a crisis mode, to respond fast and adequately to uncertain situation, which may result as a first reaction to blame someone else who is guilty for moving you out of this comfort zone and looking this other as a victim. And we do this very often without having the legitimate information that could explain certain reaction. It is easy to dichotomize and stereotype and judge from our cultural lenses if we forget to reposition ourselves in other situations and other shoes. I also would like to focus your attention on two additional points that I think are really important to consider in this COVID and post-COVID situation. Respect to the rules. You probably know that different cultures have different ways of understanding and obeying the rules. Canada is described as originally as a rule-based country and a society with high respect to rules. What does happen now with the rules that we have lived under? It is clear that in crisis, the rules don't apply in the same way. You heard that the deadline for rent payment has been extended, reducing class sizes in schools, improving senior social housing, for example, which makes some activists to question why we need a crisis to change the situation, to change the rules or conditions that can serve better the society. How should we reflect on this? What we can learn from such situation to change the rules and improve rights? We have examples about changing the regulations for police officers, proposal for changing the status and guidelines for temporary foreign workers to fast track for their permanent residence, improving the conditions for seniors in social houses. So second point that I would like to focus your thoughts and reflection is how distance restrictions has been interpreted from mainstream Canadians and from immigrants viewpoint. When we speak about distancing and isolation, mainstream Canadian born could learn from the men and women who have started anew in a land that they do not recognize. Immigrants are experts in adjusting to the pain and the confusion that distance can generate, even when it saves lives. Immigrants already know how it feels to stay away from those that you love, unable to visit the stores, the streets because of war and conflict. Immigrants understand the agony of not being able to comfort faraway friends and family who are sick or alone or distressed. Immigrants have suffered when funerals go on without their presence. But immigrants also learn that such trials create opportunities for growth. The loneliness, the helplessness that one feels when in a strange land without family or community networks can lead to the discovery of one's own resilience and strength. And the sadness of losing what was once familiar, a shared meal, in-person chat, and a hug, the everyday routine of the day can turn into a joy and exhilaration that comes from the challenge of starting another life, full of revitalizing rituals and original ways of thinking, of transforming. So remember this and try to find your own path for revitalization and transforming. So my point with this presentation today was to engage you in a conscious learning and reflections that will transform us to act responsibly, consciously, and with compassion. Action that links our knowledge, cognitive, emotional, and social, different perspective, the sense of power, assigned privilege, and positionality to generate alternative solutions where justice, equity, and humility are addressed and expressed genuinely. So I'll stop here and thank you for listening to us, and let's open the floor to your questions and comments.
So thank you, Director Morales and Dr. Jurkova. So we have prepared some questions for discussion and reflection as listed on the slide. You're more than welcome to start with these questions, or if you have any questions that kind of triggered throughout the presentation, you're more than welcome to raise the questions as well. I believe Miriam would be the one that monitored this section. So I think I'm gonna stop sharing here. Or Miriam, maybe you could jump in, and then while I keep the slides open to the floor, to audience.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe. I think it would be a good idea for the participants to also be able to see the questions. We also have one question posted by Ray, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Joe, I just posted the question to you in the chat.
Okay.
So I see one question from Nina, and that pertains around the unschooling of immigrants. I think I'll take a run at this one, Nina, in what we are experiencing as a settlement serving provider from our organization is, you know, when prior to COVID, you had certain barriers that immigrants faced in terms of transportation, child minding, accessibility. In one way, because services were shifted online, that sort of reduced the barrier of transportation and child minding. However, we saw some new barriers coming forth, and that is, again, and it's going back to some of the social determinants or the economic factors, is that some immigrants were not adept in terms of computer literacy. Again, in some households, you only had one computer. And if you had kids who were, you know, having to do a lot of schooling online, that impacted some of the ability to present widespread services for them to access. So yes, in some ways, we saw that there was an impact due to COVID based on the schooling or some of the learning. However, we did find too that we were able to reach out and do expanded services online. We noticed that we had to do more education and more teaching. However, again, you know, different cultures, you know, are more culturally attuned to interacting face to face and building trust and in building relationship. And I think those were factors that that we see that's impacting some of the delivery of services.
Yeah, thanks so much. And there was this question from Ray Grant, who's asking, bearing in mind that some races have higher percentages of hypertension, certain cancers, etc., can these comorbidities account for the higher rates of serious illness and mortality among certain racial groups?
Okay. Anyone else want to go, or do you want me to take a run at this, folks? I would say that yes, while certain ethnicities do have a proclivity and a predisposition for certain conditions, I think what COVID has done is added another layer onto it. And again, if you go back to what Dr. Joe highlighted in some of the social determinants of health, we see that based on geography, based on their living conditions, based on some of these factors, I think that has also added, like I said, an additional factor that would exacerbate the existing conditions.
Thank you, Rick. So one of the things that I wanted to add on to that is when people did pinpoint their situation of being sick with COVID, they will look at the one side of it instead of looking at the whole person, looking at their gender, their education background, and their immigrant status as well. So I would say that so I hope that this session will really kind of open our understanding in terms of embracing our understanding in terms of pinpointing people's lived experiences or their sickness with the COVID, and try to think from another side and try to adopt a more kind of holistic understanding in terms of understanding people's lived experiences and social oppressed lived experiences as well.
I can add something also to this question, and I saw there is another one that can be connected for some practices, suggestions for some concrete initiatives in response to increasing racism during this time. I would say the racist comments, systemic racism has been existed even before COVID. The fact that now many institutions confirm that and realize that we need to be more open-minded and more conscious in our reactions, in our comments, in our knowledge development, in order to not build challenges and barriers for people, not just for Black or people from other intersectional different identities, including LGBT and Q and specific ethnic groups. You saw the statistics slide that Rick presented, and actually the results are not very optimistic and positive for Alberta compared to the rest of the province. So we as service providers, I know now these big activities exist in the society, which knowledge, even the knowledge has been some kind of commercialized. Almost everybody who have heard about anti-racism and diversity started to create workshops. But when I mentioned in my presentation, be very conscious which sessions to attend. Look at who are more credible and trustful sources of knowledge. And of course, as a service provider, you can serve as a leader and motivator to your staff, to your colleagues, to your friends, families, and everybody that you work and live with to think and to be more open-minded for the situation around us. Very often we react with our unconscious biases on autopilot. We make comments that after that we will be shamed to hear that these comments were said by us. But that's why when you make comments, when you express something, even very often these comments, this racial attitude is a result of the fear, because we don't know much about this group. We don't know how this specific group has been deprived from something that we have by default, or it was assigned for us as a privilege, being white or being educated or middle class. We've never had experience how, for example, a homeless person can live, or somebody who has 2 or 3 PhDs and come here and work as a taxi driver or whoever, and many other obstacles that face everyday people who are Black or Muslim or newcomers. So in this way, just all these steps of developing knowledge and sensitivity, being more cognitive and curious to understand this, more emotionally supporting these people and not keep silence, which means that you support such kind of meaning if you stay silent.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, Sinela, some of the things that we do concretely as a settlement service in the rural areas, when we approach working in those particular rural contexts, first of all, we have a philosophy that the community is our client. We're not just delivering one-on-one services. So we do have diversity workshops, and part of our advocacy is to promote greater understanding, greater awareness, and an education, a knowledge-based approach. We look at working with different community stakeholders. We form advisory groups, and we have specific committees in each one of these communities where we have an office. We work with community stakeholders in creating a committee that is bent on looking at fostering conditions and creating a situation, or creating the right conditions to foster inclusion, participation, and engagement by newcomers in all those communities. So there are some concrete work that we're doing with different community stakeholders in trying to mitigate against some of the backlash. Even when some of the backlash happened in the High River, in the Foothills region, we were out in the forefront, working with community groups and working with some of those folks who were opposed to what was going on, and trying to mitigate against and provide deeper understanding to folks. So I think looking at this is, how do we bring everyone at the table so we can get the competing tensions out and try to reduce the confrontational approach by trying to look at more inclusive opportunities to have dialogue and to foster actions to show again that within each community we could in fact foster positive and inclusive practices.
All right, thanks so much. Actually, the next question is very much relevant to what you were just talking about. So Ezgi asks, what are some practical, concrete initiatives service providers can take, right, in response to increasing racism during this time? So any additional thoughts on this?
I think that's what, I was looking at the question, I was answering that. I'll tell you too, within the city, we have a program, it's called our Regional Outreach Program, and we work specifically with ethnocultural groups to hear some of the issues that they're facing in the community as a particular ethnic group. And then we work with them in looking at solving some of the issues that they're facing and them coming up with some solutions. So one particular group we worked with in building leadership within that particular group, and they're working with people from their different ethnic backgrounds in fostering deeper understanding and helping them cope with some of the barriers and some of the issues that they face within the community. So I think a specific takeaway from that is connecting well with the ethnocultural members in each community. That has been one of the desired goals. I've said to my staff at every committee meeting, as part of our practice, or part of our community connection work, we want to engage the different ethnocultural communities along with mainstream community members as well. You can't just engage one without the other. This is a multiple pathway to inclusion and to reducing some of these attitudes that we see that's mostly negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much.
And also try to know as much as possible your community, because very often we divide it on community, on providers and service recipients. So you also may need some services in some point. So don't divide the community in such kind of range. Yeah, try to engage in the community even until this physical distance and all the restrictions of gathering. We still have venues that we can learn more about our society, our community, the needs that people expect from us as service providers.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be done on an individual level as well as a collective, right? Community oriented place to deal with these issues. Yeah, so we have a few more minutes. If you would like to maybe talk about another question that was presented on the screen. I don't see any other questions by the audience.
So there was one question directed to me, but I think I could open it to the floor and then invite our panelists to join our discussion. Sorry about the background of my construction noise because my neighbor is doing some construction. So this question is about unemployment. With unemployment rate of 11.8 due to Alberta's economy and COVID-19 pandemic, what is the impact for some immigrant groups to secure employment, and what employers need to know in order to attract, retain, and develop immigrant workers? So I would start with this question. I think for this question is mainly for what immigrants will need to be prepared for this changing nature of work, as well as what employers will need to respond to this changing nature of work in this COVID-19 pandemic context. So I think for immigrants, it depends on if they have already landed here as immigrants or they were pre-arrival. If they are pre-arrival, I think it would be very necessary and important for them to understand the context of the changing nature of work in the Canadian context, especially the online environment and what will be changing. Maybe the networking will be changing to the online environment, and what are the tools that will be important to connect with employer prior to their arrival. For example, LinkedIn could be important. And also to delve into those organization websites will be important as well. So for the immigrants who have arrived here, I think, again, the online learning environment is important, as well as Dr. Jurkova was talking about the changing nature of the multifaceted online environment and the reflection and the positionality as well. So I think for those immigrants, I think to learn to readapt themselves to this new kind of online environment when they're looking for a job is very important. So for the employer, oftentimes immigrants, the term of immigrants is blamed as a deficit, as undesirable, as different. So I think really at the time of COVID-19, it's really crucial for employers to shift their mind from thinking immigrants as a deficit, as undesirable, to what values that they could bring to the site, they could bring to the organizations and companies to boost their economy, to boost their economic outcomes. And also I think some of the organizations, I know that they have cultural diversity committee, but some of them they don't. So I would say it's the role of HR to really provide trainings for those employers and to expand their thinking and understanding of how important that immigrants they are bringing and refugees they are bringing to the site, and what values that they could be important to help out those business, rather than thinking them as the outsider, to embrace their differences, to embrace their differences as valuable assets to their local business. So that's my understanding of this question. Yeah.
So Dr. Joe, let me add two pieces to this piece. So first of all, I want to talk about when people use the term immigrants, what does it connotate? See, I think sometimes when we talk in this kind of atmosphere, in this type of event, in some of these spectrums, and sometime in mainstream, when people talk about immigrants, there's a visual picture that comes to mind. Because I'll say for some immigrants, these are some of the issues, and for others, that's not the case. So if I take a look at some of the in the workplace, take a look at which immigrant groups were on the front line, doing some essential work, working in some stores, working in places like Walmart throughout this whole COVID. and look at some of the meat processing plants. So if we take a look at some ethnic groups, the impact of COVID in terms of employment wasn't so much detrimental in terms of the economics or having a job, but they were putting their lives at risk. So if we change the narrative and said, how were immigrants contributing to the economy during COVID? And we change that narrative a bit, we'll see exactly the risk that was involved by some members and some different ethnic groups. So I think, needless to say, when we disaggregate some of this, the narratives, I think it could tell some different stories. I know some of the things we're doing right now. We have a project in the community of Claresholm, and they were one of 11 communities in Canada to receive this federal project, and the only one in Canada too. And they have partnered with us to provide settlement services. And one of the things, and Sinela is going to be spearheading the training for employers. So what we're doing is doing some specific targeted training in terms of cultural competency skills and knowledge about the workplace from a perspective of, if you're a newcomer, what does that look like? And for the employer, what does it mean to work with people from diverse backgrounds?
Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. And thanks again for taking part in our initiative. We were very happy to host this discussion. Very informative and very interesting. And then I know that you have these questions for the audience to reflect on, right, and to continue the discussion. We're planning to have another one on the 23rd of September, if I'm not mistaken, which would be in conversation with the Statistics Canada as well. And you will see some data and statistics that are recently, in a way, collected on the issue. So if you're interested in the topic, please tune in for that discussion as well. But I would like, on behalf of Center for Race and Culture, to thank everyone at Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, and also all the participants or attendees. Please take a few minutes to do the feedback form that is shared in the chat box with you. There is a link. These could definitely help us with planning future events. Thanks so much.
Thank you kindly, folks, and thank you so much, the Center for Race and Culture. This is awesome work that you're doing in, looking at ways in which we could start working on mending and healing in our society. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, keep going, keep doing, because the society needs kind of leadership in spreading the education and reminding that it's under our action to develop the society that it's fair and sensitive and just for everyone. So thank you for having us. And thank you everyone who attended the session.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Yes. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
Stay
safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.